This is going to be a bit of a nonsense recording, I guess, with just a few scattered ideas. I keep on thinking I'm remiss for not reading out some of the dialogue that I've produced on some sort of like agony aunt sort of a question and answer thing, which had some nice insights on a few things: gender relations, identity politics, or the dynamics of the asymmetries between the sexual competition strategies between the biological sexes in our culture and things like that, and sort of how that relates to the kind of the parasitic ideologies of feminism and other toxic sorts of there are a lot of things that sort of follow this kind of formula of solving, of supposedly tackling a problem. This is a disparate sort of point that has to do with the kind of the socialistic kind of mentality, and I thought that this might go some ways into a good rebuttal against this style of thinking, although one likes to think that these sorts of things might be instructive, although how inaccessible they are to people who don't who are captivated by their very rigid and narrow field of contemplation, in order to preserve their brittle ideological framework. But there's basically this kind of the socialistic formula of solving problems, which is, for instance, let me make up an example as like an environmental socialistic sort of sentiment, that imagine that if people threw away garbage, which is obviously in some level that could be taken as a heuristic for an unsustainable flow of materials within an economy, that you have to pay sort of a penalty for the amount of refuse that you generate, and that penalty is hinged, is welded to your income level. And so sort of like you pay 1% of your income for each kilogram of refuse, and therefore the rich are sort of in the internal thinking of this logic, the rich who are so much more incentivized by money will therefore be the flagship and will generate the solution to the problem, having command of more funds and more greatly incentivized to solve this problem. Will solve the problem for the rest of us. We'll get the gears turning. And that that sort of that lowest common denominator, one size fits all solution, while the government has absolutely no accountability for actually managing and implementing a system which would be sustainable and coming up with it. No, like this is outsourced to the rich, which are meant to be so proficient and good that they must be good for the rest of us, that they are the ones that have enough of the spare capacity and the free time to solve this problem. So it's just up to government's job to make sure that they are properly incentivized to do it, and then they sort of drag everyone else along by coming up with the solution, while government essentially is the hero who sort of designed it by indirect sort of coercion. It's sort of like the sort of the moral landscape of I must think of a good analogy. I mean, it's hard, but because it's parasitic, to a large degree. It requires vilifying people, in this situation, the rich, according to some, like ideological simplification of the narrative, and everyone just has to sort of go along with that, and it's not allowed to be particular about assessing the situation. It has to treat the situation in such an obtuse and indirect way, so it's to never, like, you just have to believe that that program is the form of the solution, is the correct moralistic reduction, and it sort of forces that reduction into the culture. It sort of forces it to be imprinted onto everything. And if you challenge that cultural hegemony, then you are you are labeled reactionary, when the whole thing itself is geared towards a reactionary implementation of the so-called solution, which is not actually directly arrived at in any way possible. Sorry, just interrupted there. So I mean, the ironic thing is that they supposedly tackle the problem not by solving it, but by like universalizing the problem and then pigeonholing the guilt and the shame, or at least the sort of the solution of that problem. They pin it on a very particular part of the system, which it is their job supposedly to sort of allocate. And so essentially they narrate in an authoritarian way that their solution is just effectively the culture of authoritarianism. And which is problematic because it can never admit any fault, it can never take responsibility. So when their formula doesn't work, they're sort of trapped into indicting, if they give any ground, they're trapped into indicting their entire political program and system. And so they're sort of perversely incentivized to sort of just double down and continue on. And that's why you need sort of categorical, designations and breakdowns, so that you can offset the internal pressure, so that you can sort of blame the right classification, so that the system itself, the authoritarian design of the political structure won't be questioned. You have to have a strong enough labeling categories system that is imprinted in the culture. And so, this already sort of begins the spiral of doom that sort of has everyone having to believe in these group definitions, and language itself becomes encoded in this pervasive moral scheme, which is obviously hideous and dehumanizing in so many ways possible, because it completely strips the independent being of the citizenry and transforms the polity into a wolf tribes, effectively. And it's funny because generally the general mantra of the so-called left has just always been, it's the top that's evil. It's sort of everything comes from the machinations of the elite in some sense, and they have completely and this comes up when you get, for example, trade unions that are very bad for their members, and they're very bad for the economy, and they're very bad for everything. And then you get successful unions who actually are intelligent and are responsible and are accountable and do well for their members. And how formulaic and stupid the solutions of the bad trade unions are, and how in contrast to the good trade unions that actually are able to promote a better situation, just how mechanistic the bad ones are at just doubling down on their continuous, toxic rhetoric, essentially, and vilifying the top, and not seeing their own sympathy-fueled, there's always this almost structural sympathy between the people at the bottom and the corruption in a system. That it doesn't get perpetrated from the top, it gets supported from the bottom. It gets even demanded and expected from the bottom, and it's often clothed in this revolutionary rhetoric and presumption and expectation that the formula just needs to be applied politically more clearly. That it's just not being radically pursued enough. other intellectual point that I sort of wanted to bring up as like a theme. What was the first thing I just went into? So I went into vilification, I guess, and the kind of, I didn't really actually get into the technical specificity of the kind of sophistry which perpetuates all these things, but I did at least illustrate it once or twice. There was another point that I wanted to raise that's been on my mind. It was about identity politics, I believe. I just came up with something when I started this recording. It was a nice little curt maxim about the problem of something. What do I call it? Appearances? No. Things being leveraged. Sympathy. I'll have to think about it. It was a nice, short, clear idea, which I think cut through something quite cleanly. Something about questions. Oh. Well, this wasn't the thing that I was trying to remember, but it's still perhaps a fragment of something that's useful, although it's very sort of set in epistemology and things like that, but and philosophy of the psyche, which I do think is intrinsic to issues of epistemology. So let me just think how to technically phrase this accurately. Now I I guess I'm not going to do that, but it's something like the notion that that self-knowledge is conserved in an epistemic structure or system or project, or and so the only thing that you might come to know from a particular proposition about self-knowledge, or from an implicit perspective which has an inbuilt self-knowledge value that it operates and or functions from, which in some sense can be an unconscious belief then, although it's not patently contended, it is tacitly contended, and so you're sort of damned even without on this point, even without let's say direct intention, but through indirect intentionality on this line as well. That's somewhat obvious, but okay. So the important thing is that at least in an epistemological sort of context, you have to be conscious of whatever self-knowledge you have, and you better make it sort of complete from the start, basically, because you're not going to get any more out of the system, although you might sort of, in a fumbling way, you might sort of realize that you need to go back to the drawing board, so you might get the sort of existential sort of reaction that your system is lacking, or something like that, or is in deficit, but that observation is not going to be sort of a new observation, and so it's not going to sort of slap you in the face, and because your position started off from a kind of nebulous form of self-knowledge, or an incomplete sense, it's not going to ring any alarm bells. And in fact, all one can ever do, both in having a problematic form of self-knowledge or a proper one, is just experience the characterological effects of that proposition of self-knowledge. And then I just wanted to say that let's say what Nietzsche would have called slave morality, and what I harp on about, talking about narratives, people having this kind of external locus of control in an epistemological sense of accountability or irresponsibility, that all these problematic ways of contending one's contemplative life, or understanding one's own consciousness, let's just say, or something like that, is that you get to know something in defiance, or at least in absence of the kind of the central cog of some properly contended position or proposition on self-knowledge. And so you're not experiencing these other claims of knowledge via a proposition of self-knowledge, and therefore you've got this kind of internal codependency on having this knowledge, which is built on obscuring or solidifying or freezing that position of self-knowledge. And I say that is true in both, let's say, having a proper contending of let's say a good, valid position of self-knowledge, and also a lack thereof. They're both going to be prone to that form of consequence. And so in some sense, mental karma is unavoidable, and it's only transcended within its own reconciliation and sort of actualization and affirmation of those underlying mechanics, which does not make itself a reactive component, but okay, I don't even want to sort of refine that analogy because it's not going to be that useful. I'd rather just get into the mechanics. So self-knowledge is conserved. So you better start with looking at knowledge through the position of living, through the proposition of a properly contended or a form of life. And anyway, I just wanted to sort of say some nice things around this so I could get to the very thing, is that the knowledge of good and evil, therefore by similar by a similar sort of process is the proposition of a false ego, that the only way to preserve a knowledge of good and evil is to no longer be living in the sense of a true recourse to one's living consciousness, and one instead has a role to play within the knowledge of good and evil, a role to play in relation and into the identity that good and evil then is sort of, and I mean that's meant to be an archetypal position, because I mean it's just basically a dichotomy in some sort of I mean good and evil obviously are associated with moral authority, or some kind of order, or ordering, some kind of objective claim about an epistemic source of boundary which is imposed from the outside, or at least can be imprinted on the inside from the sort of the absolute force which the exterior of what becomes a narrative, but that narrative is somewhat imprinted on the identity of what then becomes the false ego. And so the false ego is the conduit of obscuring the nebulous state which self-knowledge is sort of left to be fudged as a kind of to sort of have its consignment of sort of validity conferred onto it, by a rather sort of cheap rationalization of having to categorize everything into a kind of into some kind of basic false dichotomy, and I mean these notions in philosophy I think already are rather plain and available. What do they call them, sort of black and white thinking, but I think what is not understood is how pernicious it is. It has to grow like a virus to feel that it's making progress, it has to rationalize itself into more and more fields, and the field in which it is an abject failure and which it sort of falls down and which is usually left as the last bastion or the last, sort of, after we know more things about the world, then we'll sort out the interior, then we'll sort out, and there's already this huge pretense that they have worked out a lot of the interior space because but they've only done so because of how that's different devices or formulaic forms of activity in the interior space can be observed as an external expression and aligned with all the other sort of criteria, which is hinged to this sort of this presumptuous point of initiating this project, which is the obscured self-knowledge in favor of this, sort of good and evil dichotomy, false binary. That's, I think, what people complain about in philosophy, that when you've got a sort of a false binary. So yeah, I think that this has perhaps been explored by other people who do talk about some philosophical and psychological things, but the thing about false binaries is that they produce problems in terms of false ego. They always, for a false binary to be depended on or relied in, it will create a kind of a codependency on a form of false ego, which is capable of facilitating that form of rationalism, that form of puerile, fudged rationalism, which has no basis for itself other than the continued dispersal on the level of false knowledge. So it will crystallize that characterological form of false knowledge unless it is eventually abandoned. And the problem is that because it's so good at rationalizing itself and integrating and aligning whatever it has already integrated and aligned with yet more, you end up with a kind of this very specialized thing. And wouldn't it be nice if the kind of psychological reality and the structures of the interior space matched up with this particular propensity of a very particular style of false ego, and so this is how you get the sort of the psychological somewhat driver of both political and ideological machination, and culture itself, can be seen as a sort of as a warring battleground. Of these very, very different forms of false ego that all have their kind of rationalization that is tethered to, let's say, distorting various different subjects and issues that relate to levels of psychological operation. And their hope to sort of align things according to that way, and then we go through this kind of cycle of cultural what do they call it, the Great Wheel, or the sort of the Four Ages and such, and sort of how the cultural hegemony sort of changes hands between sort of a different kind of hegemonic fad and fashionable cutting edge, as the sort of And I mean, this probably has to do with the turnover of the generations themselves, that the young will naturally tend towards some looking for some vulnerability of counterculture, some vulnerability in the hegemony, to make a form of counterculture the sort of the beachhead of their. Because I mean, obviously, in the context of disruption, it's a lot easier to not be saddled with the work of having a solid position of self-knowledge. I mean, you know, people always complain about the young, famous philosophers, famous historical voices. Everyone constantly is complaining about the sort of the depravity of the young. And I mean, it is true that in immaturity there is certainly a large extent of nescience and sort of you know, the lowest common denominator of any sort of group or generalization is going to be a kind of an abject and sorry sort of state and strategy of optimization, but well, in general, there are a lot of worldly promises that are made in order to garnering a power within the false ego's legionary domain, and sort of and the value is obvious in being part of a consortium that is aligned and in power. You know, we can. The only problem is that, I mean, that almost that general formulaic strategy, which, you know, sort of has this propensity to be fascistic, is that it cannot sustain itself. That as soon as it actually congeals into a very fixed narrative, it even loses its own impetus to a large degree, because if it's not sort of scaling the enemy walls, and it's not sort of, if it doesn't have that radical revolutionary edge to it, when it actually is the sort of in vogue thing, you know, it doesn't really operate that well, you know. And this goes into my general critique of what you would call underdog cultures. You know, it's ironic how the fascists love Nietzsche and how much they fell foul of his entire philosophical program and thoughts, but a lot of his work was also corrupted by what was it, his cousin, his female cousin or something, or his sister or something. Sort of stitched together some notebooks and things like that, and ended up sort of turning a lot of things on their head. Anyway, it's not important. I mean, so much so that you know, it's sort of, I mean, I really do believe that Hitler had to essentially roll the dice. He had to sort of gamble with fate to prove that God was on his side, or that, you know, there was something meritorious about the kind of the ship that he was the captain of. You know, it's always problematic. It's easy when you're somewhere in the middle, but when you're at the top echelon, when you sort of are the pillar of the mythology, then you have to prove that the mythology is worth its kind of pantheistic pretension. That it does capture the value, and essentially, because it is built on this kind of existential survivalist, you know, sort of excitement and anxiousness. If you're not actually in an immediate war, if you're not actually sort of obviously fighting against a contest of other, if you're not sort of in the Darwinistic sort of sausage machine, which society is actually, society in a positive sense, which civilization essentially, to a large extent, is sort of focused on ameliorating and sort of solving that problem, or at least when it is being successful at being a civilization. The idea that obviously society or culture becomes decadent and so becomes vulnerable to virulent strains of mind virus and such, and because there are people who, the so-called left, the so-called identitarian left, have got it so wrong, doesn't mean that just merely contradicting every line that they say, because it's funny how their whole creed is almost, it emphatically projects fascism onto the status quo in order to justify its reactionary ultra response to it. The amount of airtime given to fringe people on the fascistic side of politics in order to justify this hysterical, histrionic cultural paradigm that can sort of help secure the feminist confusion, essentially, that allows them to continue to believe themselves some kind of systemic victim instead of, so they can shirk the realization of how much of a perpetrator they are in their own supposed oppression, and also oppression conceived of from that kind of systemic level is fundamentally insoluble. In that, you actually follow their program and you end up with the worst situation, and then they say that you have to do things even more radically. It's self-agonizing. In fact, it measures its ideological success by its own practical failure, so that it can continue to take up more space in people's minds, essentially, as the only pressing concern of anything. So much so that it deprives knowledge of anything. It's sort of it's exactly like the sort of the false ego thing. I guess the difference here is that we've got an ideology that is actually conferring identity on people. So it's actually saying, take on this vehicle of a false ego. Be a woman, be a lived experience XYZ. Experience your life through that, and then, because then you are something that is identifiable and that can sort of join in a particular faction, that you can have a shared block of power within this false ego power sharing, in which politics becomes this kind of totalitarian cultural sort of thing, which is exactly how fascists see society. They have the same exact fascistic worldview and temperament and personality. And many of the so-called these liberal left, they see the end of it, and they think it through, and they realize that actually they should actually just convert to fascism, but because that isn't culturally in vogue right now, they'll just lay low, sort of thing. So they end up sort of actually creating both the promulgation of fascistic values and although it doesn't appear that way now, but if you actually just look at the sort of inane rhetoric, they do everything they can to empower the fascistic worldview and values. That's what they are, and that's why they will. You sort of see it in South Africa, especially. The sort of the appetite now for black nationalistic, overt racialist interpretation of civil life, moral life, political values, even as it is literally the rhetorical vehicle that has been used to facilitate corruption at every level and disruption, and it's used for the centralization of power into essentially political hands and political cronyism. What do they call it? Kleptocracy, and yet they just keep on doubling down on the same program, the same political solution. It's sort of like that level of abject stupidity and overt corruption, which is both moral and ethical, moral and practical, rather. It is both a corruption of ethics, and it's a corruption of workability, and they don't care. Because the self-righteousness, and continuing to align with this identity vehicle of politics is more important to vindicate that perspective. I mean, at the very least, I think this will all make very good history if it is looked at honestly, but perhaps that's always been the case. I mean, we obviously didn't learn the lessons from the 1930s and 40s from this culture. We didn't actually learn how to overcome this culture, to understand it. And until we do, hopefully this will be the time where we're actually recording what's going on. We're recording the ideological themes and issues, so that we can be immunized from this evil. And South Africa, I think, will stand out as a historical example, even as an abject failure. Or if it does not become an abject failure, it is because insight will be shone onto these kinds of ethical and unworkable facilitators of corruption, and how this ideology fuels the worst kind of histrionic personality cults and the most sort of horrendous kind of narrative projections, which are used to correct the narrative. How reactionary. Condemning people into a narrative instead of interpersonal navigation of life, which gets completely surrendered into this formulaic lowest common denominator sort of factionalism and this neo-tribalism, which is fed lip service constantly and such. But what is the other thing that must... Oh yeah, so I mean, as a success or as a failure. Historically, it will be very valuable to see how a nation disrupted itself effectively in order to pander to this sort of retributivist identity, revenge, and emotionalism, and insane politics, and how many people voted to endorse, these disgusting forms of moral degeneration and political corruption, because it fed the histrionic narrative. Although it would be nice if there were clearer opposition parties that identified these evils and called them out. Oh yes, I wanted to... This is something that, you can't... I mean, if you actually want to actually combat these people directly in terms of rhetoric, in terms of politics, you can't let them get away with their fascistic poetry. When they give their little sympathetic, narrative or whatever, you actually have to work out how to rebuke it. You actually have to argue with it. You do have to be a bit careful because you can really play into their hands. You have to find the middle ground which they're completely obscuring. You have to say that essentially what's wrong with their rhetoric is that it's not going to fix anything, that it pretends that it's going to do something positive and that it can actually do something better, but it is the cause of the worsening problem. And that it is in league with the things that have caused the devastation in the first place, which is going to be almost an abstract moral argument that's going to be appended onto the practical implication of that form of retributivist revenge policy and things like that. Because, they will essentially use this sympathetic narrative and this fascistic poetry or whatever as a kind of, it has two faces. It's one time they're calling for violence and another time they're calling for a kind of self-pity for their identity, which just deserves to be given its room and its space, and it must just be left to its own space. That must be left as a safe space for it to help recover itself in this, sympathy time or whatever, that is appropriate according to their narrative. And they'll talk about their narrative as that they've been attacked and they've been, deprived and all these sorts of things and how disadvantaged they are. And then you have to literally find a way to debunk their formulaic thing that they're talking about historical things. They're not talking about the disadvantage and how it should be tackled in the present. Or when they're talking about historical things as if history can be fixed and it can't. And you actually have to do something in the meantime. You have to do something about it, something that's real. And all their solutions are all focused on trying to balance history by answering an eye for an eye or something like that. And you have to say just how stupid that is from a policy government perspective. That is for the courts to do something like that, and it is for Parliament to make law that actually has a procedure that is going to be effective and is going to not squander the opportunities of development, which is completely destroyed because of wanting to create not growth, but a kind of redistribution of identity possessiveness into a kind of histrionic game of fairness. Oh yeah, that's also wanted to talk about this obsession with fairness and how fairness, that was also to do with the rich thing as well. The idea that you're going to make the economy fairer. It's a very obtuse treatment, or it has to do with that thing I put in my first recording. Because when your goal is to make something more fair, there is no criteria that you can use in order to debunk it as being less effective and less helpful than some other alternative. Because fairness is divorced from actually fixing things. Like, you could argue, well, it's actually more fair if we actually do something that is effective rather than if we just try to do something that is fair according to your revenge politics. So, sort of they use these absolute sort of framework of moral language that they own, that they sort of totalitarian, in some kind of authoritarian fashion, they say you're not allowed to speak on the notion of fairness because fairness belongs to our conception of identity. So you really, sadly, it's hard to debunk them and you can very fall into letting them just play on their narrative. You have to disrupt their narrative. You have to disrupt their fascist poetry, and you have to levy the argument that quite clearly disrupts the kind of the formulaic simplicity and oversimplicity that they're wishing to invoke and apply to people, which is ironically what is destroying both social justice and the development of the country. even as the so-called Chief Justice, the former president of the Constitutional Court, which I guess in some sense, perhaps it is correct that he is no longer referred to as, well, I guess he is perhaps also the president of the Constitutional Court, but that he is, if that is not his title anymore, that at least is appropriate, because no one has betrayed the Constitution more than Chief Justice Mogoeng. Anyway,